Hi, y'all, and welcome to tonight's live stream. Well, I promised you a wild ride with the Natalie Cochran case, and wow, it has not disappointed. It has been an absolutely crazy ride. Today, the state rested. I was stunned. Technically, I was stunned earlier this morning when I read in a local newspaper from up there that they were going to rest. I would never have guessed that. It seemed really quick. They are on a razor thin edge as to whether or not they have made their case against Natalie Cochran. But they did bring some critical evidence today, some absolutely important, critical emails or text messages, actually, that were sent back and forth with some relatives of Natalie's. And those are part of what is going to be the closing argument, what is going to be the state's case. Now, Natalie Cochran's the primary charge in this case is that Natalie Cochran murdered her husband. Prosecutors say that she overdosed him with insulin and that caused him to have such low blood sugar that he passed out, that he had cerebral edema, brain swelling, and ultimately died from that about 5 days later. So they believe, prosecutors believe, that dose of insulin was something Natalie did. She was a pharmacist, so they say she would have known exactly how to do this, exactly what to use, and that's what she did. That is not the only charge that has been levied against her. She also is presently serving 11 years and 3 months in federal prison for running a Ponzi scheme. According to prosecutors, she ripped off her family, friends, acquaintances by pretending to have a gigantic company that ran arms sales to the government. They purchased guns, they purchased armor, various items that the military might need, and they sold them to the government. And were doing $1 billion worth of business, is what she claimed. But the feds say, no, siree, was doing no such thing. And that wasn't actually happening. Instead, she was faking all that. She was just taking people's money in as investors from her own family, her own friends. She ripped off her in-laws to the tune of everything they'd ever earned or saved. She ripped off her own parents. She ripped off her own brother. All of those people lost their money in what the feds say is a giant Ponzi scheme. She did plead guilty to that, and as I said, is serving time. That's not the only allegation either. There were also allegations that Natalie Cochran faked scholarships, actually went to schools and gave out scholarships in her deceased husband's name, which she had no money to actually carry through. She had no way to actually give it. So it cited students and parents received these scholarships, may well have made decisions about where they were going, schools they turned down based on the fact that this scholarship was available. But in the end, it wasn't. Also alleged that she faked cancer so she could get away with things, and even ripped off the local Little League to the tune of $10,000. Those all should not be at issue in this case, but the Ponzi scheme itself has been an issue in terms of motive. The prosecutor says the reason Natalie killed her husband, the reason she injected him with insulin and wanted him to die, was because he all along had not known about the very critical information that she was running a Ponzi scheme, that there wasn't a real company, that he thought they had a real company together. They owned the businesses together, and he thought they really were raking in all that much money. He had no idea his family and friends were being ripped off. He was about to either discover it or maybe blow the cover. And because of that, Natalie decided she had to kill him. So, but there has been no evidence really to suggest that Michael Cochran was unknowing thus far, but there were 3 very, very important text messages I'm going to show you tonight. So welcome to our first 5 in the chat tonight. KCAN4, Cat Ride, Rosie McCrank, Sharon D, and just me. Special shout out to y'all, and welcome everybody. We started the day with Dr. Paul Uribe, who is a forensic pathologist with a great deal of experience. He's done over 2,500 autopsies, which is less, I think it was 6,000 that the first medical examiner had done, the first forensic pathologist. We've had 2 testify in this case. Uribe is the second. And that's because the body of Michael Cochran was exhumed twice. He was buried and they decided, wait, this may have been a murder. And they went back to look at the body, but that came out as inconclusive. I can't determine, said the first medical examiner. I can't determine whether or not I can't determine the cause of death. So Uribe said something different. He's done 2,500 autopsies, a couple of big ones. He wrote the federal opinion in the George Floyd case, and he also had investigated a suspected insulin-related serial killer in Clarksburg, West Virginia. So in this case, he was hired by the local DA and asked to perform a second autopsy. They exhumed Michael's body again. So one of the things he talked about was he went through the medical records in advance. He found that the CT scans did not show any head injury. That's important because in one of the interviews with Natalie Cochran, she actually said that Michael had fallen and hit his head while he was in the kitchen. And even more concerning to him was the idea that when the person was admitted to the hospital, when Michael's was admitted to the hospital, his blood sugar was extremely low, 21. There's been argument over whether or not the correct level would have been 55 or 70, but for sure it wasn't 21. Dr. Uribe said, well, this was really low. And he also said that it was fluctuating in a pattern that pointed to the idea that insulin was involved. He called it a red flag. He said that when you give somebody insulin, there's this tiny window of time when you can test for it and determine how the person actually got the insulin. Because when your body makes insulin, it breaks it down into two parts. One part is insulin and the other part is C-peptide, which since the body is breaking it down as it's producing it, then anything the body has produced should be 50-50. So there should be just as much insulin as C-peptide. If what you find instead is that there's a lot of insulin and very little C-peptide, that suggests that there was insulin injected into the person, not just insulin that their body created. So he said, but you got to test right away. You definitely can't wait until after death, and you definitely can't wait until months later. In fact, his autopsy was 3 years after Michael Cochran had died. And by then he said the body had decomposed a lot. It was in bad shape. He said that he found it. He said he was told that there had been embalming, but if so, it was a really poor job of it. He said most of the soft tissue had turned into a hard soap-like substance called adipocere. And despite that, though, he says he looked at the body, he looked at all the evidence, he pointed out that a lot of the facts in the case just didn't line up with the original autopsy or the medical records. He said that raised red flags for him. So based on his findings, Dr. Uribe concluded that the most likely cause of death of Michael Cochran was someone administering insulin to him. He said there's just no other reasonable explanation for such a severe hypoglycemia. He said this is a healthy, non-diabetic person. There's just no reason for a 38-year-old to die of a sudden drop in insulin. He considered other issues, seizure disorder, heart disease, and he said those didn't really match the symptoms. So he was going with insulin, and the manner of death, he said, was homicide. He made the point that people don't accidentally administer insulin to themselves. The cross on this one I thought was really good. Nana of 7, Natalie is a female Alec Murdaugh. He's the standard by which we judge all our cases, the Alec Murdaugh standard. Do you reach the level of drama created in the Alec Murdaugh case? Thank you, Nana of 7. I appreciate it. Okay, so the cross was really very well done, I felt like. Dr. Uribe said the way he learned about the case was from the former district attorney, Benjamin Hatfield. The reason I think that had already been mentioned in the direct, and now that it was mentioned again on cross-examination, it's kind of a small fact, who hired you? The DA, Benjamin Hatfield. But I think the reason it got mentioned again is in the local area, Hatfield means something to the local people because there's been a lot of controversy surrounding him. He's no longer the DA. He resigned, but he was accused of sexual misconduct by a woman who claimed he made demands on her in exchange for dismissing charges against her, and then made more demands to dismiss the charges against her boyfriend. And eventually, he also was sued by 9 people in his office claiming hostile work environment. So I think that's why they mentioned it twice. So Michael's death happened actually 4 years before, I said 3, 4 years before this autopsy by Dr. Uribe, 5 years before his final report was prepared this past April. So the first autopsy, as I said, just they could not determine the cause of death, is what the medical examiner said. But it was just 7 months after Michael passed, and that was much closer in time, the defense pointed out. Back then, there would at least have been less decomposition than there was when Dr. Uribe actually exhumed the body and looked at it 4 years later. So Dr. Uribe fully acknowledged he could not detect insulin in Michael's system. It was way too late for that he couldn't explain why. And there was an interesting chart they did and showed there was another drop in insulin after Michael was in the hospital. So during the day that Michael fell out on the kitchen floor, Natalie said she was taking his insulin and it was fine. When he got to the hospital, it was way not fine. It was 21. And then while he was in the hospital, about a day later, it began to drop again. And it went through sort of a curve. It was fine, dropped down, and came back up. And that's similar to what had happened the first time. The defense believes that's evidence that this isn't induced by insulin. There's something wrong with him that's causing it to drop. They just didn't figure out what it was before he died. The prosecution might believe that he received additional doses of insulin, but they haven't come out and said or suggested, yeah, there was another dose secretly while he was in the hospital, for example. There's been nothing like that. So I don't think there's been a solid explanation for why it dropped again. The one witness who testified about insulin, Dr. Krieger, I think it was, I don't have that quite right, Krieger, said that she kind of dismissed that really low measure because of the fact that it was done with a fingerprint prick instead of with an actual blood draw. But that still doesn't explain the fact that it was in the hundreds, like 180, and suddenly it's at 60. Maybe she could throw out the one at 40, but she couldn't throw out the ones that were nearest to 40, like 60 and 70 on either side of it. So I still think that's an issue that the defense has a point that is something unexplained in the case. So the witness was also asked about just how long insulin would last in the body, because everybody agreed that the insulin would only last about 4 to 6 hours. So if Natalie gave it to her husband in the morning, and that was the reason he crashed on the floor and fell out, then it wouldn't explain, because that was before noon. It wouldn't explain why at 8 o'clock that night when he's at the hospital, he's got a 21, because the insulin is out of his system by then. He should have re-regulated, but it didn't work that way. So there's have been hints that maybe Natalie gave another shot of insulin in the middle of the afternoon. The prosecutor hinted at that, and then the defense said, look, she invited all these people over. There were something like 9 people in her house at some point during the day. Why would she do that if she needs to give him more insulin? If she's trying to kill him, why invite witnesses over who might get in her way while she's trying to administer more insulin to really throw him off and to make sure he died, if that's what she was doing? So Dr. Uribe said he had looked at a bunch of different potential causes for the big drop in blood sugar that happened just as Michael was arriving at the hospital. Could it be a pancreatic tumor? Could it be adrenal insufficiency? Could it be sepsis? Could it be drug effects? He said, okay, I do not believe it could be the pancreatic tumor, because the first autopsy didn't find one. But their defense said, well, but the pancreas is one of the first things in the body to decompose. So maybe that's not such a surprise. And the defense also said, look, you may have dismissed the idea that his medications could have done this, but he was taking a lot of things such as supplements, things related to bodybuilding. He was a big bodybuilder. And they said, you don't really know what he was taking. So how can you just dismiss this and pretend it isn't a real thing? And he also, the witness also said that while insulin does decompose quickly after death, there might be things that could detect it post-mortem. He just sort of volunteered that. I don't know where that came from. But there was no explanation then for why he hadn't done those tests. If it was possible to figure out if insulin was in the body, why didn't he test? And he had clearly stated earlier he couldn't do that. So it left it sort of confusing. The defense pushed him on whether he could say with absolute certainty that insulin was involved in the death of Michael. And he said he didn't use the word absolute, but that he couldn't think of any other explanation. There was no other explanation for having such profound hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, in an otherwise healthy, non-diabetic person, which, of course, the defense doesn't believe Michael was healthy. They think he was very unhealthy because of what he had done. The defense had some very effective cross-examination around the idea that Michael might have injected insulin himself because maybe as a bodybuilder, he was using it in order to bulk up, in order to help him with that. Now, Dr. Uribe said, well, I don't think bodybuilders use insulin for that reason. But I think probably a lot of us who have Googled this, well, we certainly saw that online that you can do that. And the defense came right in on that. They said, well, did you not know that that's how Mr. Universe died? Injecting himself with insulin and ending up with hypoglycemia and then dying? And he did not know that. The witness did not. And the defense also pointed out about an article they had found about the problem of hypoglycemia in bodybuilders who were taking insulin. He didn't know about that as either. So ultimately, Dr. Uribe concluded that none of Michael's medical history could explain his seizures, his heart issues, or his hypoglycemia. He felt like the cause and manner of death pointed to something else. Even if it could not be proven with absolute certainty, it pointed to the idea that he had been injected with insulin. Prosecution believes what that's all about is that Natalie was murdering him. He said he didn't think it was self-inflicted. He didn't think it was accidental, although frankly, he doesn't really have any evidence to support that. He did state that. The prosecution said, well, an unconscious person can't inject himself, can he? Sort of the suggestion being that when he was unconscious, it had to be Natalie administering it. But I thought that wasn't a very, that question didn't really hit the point because it wouldn't explain why Michael was unconscious in the first place. That seemed to be the bigger issue. So then the defense on recross raised that benzo that showed up in his urine. And there wasn't really ever any explanation for that as to why it was there, what it might mean. Did it mean he was taking that as something related to bodybuilding, something for his body? And pointed out that there was some degree of suggestion of sepsis. Sepsis is just infection. The first thing, or the thing doctors look for in that, is high white blood cell count. And he had high white blood cell count. It was 17,000, should have been 11,000 or lower. So he had high white blood cell count, but he didn't have fever. He didn't have some of the other things they might have looked at. So the doctor said, yeah, it's a consideration, but I don't think he was septic. Then the next witness was Lieutenant Timothy Bledsoe. And let me say, Tooth Sleuth Jules, that's a tongue twister for me, is a new member. Thank you, Tooth Sleuth. I'm glad for that. Lieutenant Timothy Bledsoe is a West Virginia State Police trooper, or was. He's retired now. He was with them for a very long 30 years or so. And he investigated the Natalie Cochran case, starting with the financial crimes and then moving into the death of Michael Cochran. So the state introduced right off the bat with this witness the plea agreement in the Southern District of West Virginia. It had been talked about before, but they actually introduced it as a piece of evidence. The defense objected, but the judge said, yeah, I'm bringing it in. The reason that they think that's so important, the plea agreement in federal court, is because it doesn't mention Michael. It's only aimed at Natalie. It says, Natalie did this, this, and this, and this, and she signs at the bottom saying, yes, I did. And they said, well, that proves that Michael Cochran did not know. If he had been mentioned in there, if he had known, he would have been mentioned in there as also being involved. I thought that was really, I don't like that argument at all. That is not the way federal court necessarily works. They tailor agreements to the particular facts, to the particular person. They don't necessarily include every other person. I just thought it was unfair to draw that conclusion from the plea agreement. Personal opinion on that. But there were 3 text messages that were super important. The state has had a really hard time convincing me that Michael Cochran did not know about what was going on with the company. I still don't buy it. But these 3 text messages are awfully important. I'm going to show them to you. And let me add them to the stage. They're very hard to read, and I unfortunately can't change that. So I will tell you what they say. The first was a text message from Natalie to her uncle, Charles Hawley, I think was the name they said. And she wrote, Natalie wrote, after all your contracts pay out, I won't be able to invest them anymore. I will cut your checks as they come in. I am very sorry. I wasn't transparent with Michael on all the contracts we had in the works. And the prosecutor said, and the witness said, she's apologizing and stating up front that she wasn't transparent with Michael on all the contracts. And I'll go ahead and read the other 2 and then talk a little bit about it. So this next text is from Natalie to her own sister, Penny Carrico. And she said, hey guys, I am sorry, but after I pay out your remaining contracts, I won't be able to do them anymore. I did not share all the details with Michael, and I should have been completely transparent with him. And then the third one, a text to Wendy Poteet, who is Michael's sister. Hey guys, after the contracts that are out payout, I must have written something wrong then. It's very hard to read. So, but in any event, after the contracts that are out, oh, that's right. After the contracts that are out payout, I will have to stop subcontracting and then you can see part of it's hidden. Something I was not, I assume it is, as transparent with Michael as I should have been. So those are the text messages. Each of them has the same sort of theme. The idea that Natalie wasn't transparent with Michael. And if she wasn't transparent with Michael, if she wasn't telling him what was going on, well, then maybe he really was about to discover the Ponzi scheme. And maybe he was murdered for that reason. There are some problems with that. It looks to me that it was difficult for me to read it, but I think it looks like these were written in August of the year before, which would mean Michael had known about the issue or some issue for months. It also is such an awkward, weird text message. You know, I am very sorry I wasn't transparent with Michael. It sort of has the writing 100 sentences to confess that you were sorry and to make penance in school. It has that thing. I wasn't transparent with Michael. Write that 300 times. And so it's just odd phrasing, almost like he's standing over her saying, you will write this. I'm sorry I wasn't transparent with Michael. It's just a weird thing to say because it wasn't just that she wasn't transparent with Michael. It's that she wasn't transparent with these people. She had no money to pay them. She had not actually received contracts with the government. She didn't have piles of money sitting there to pay out their contracts as the new contracts came in. Nothing was there, so she didn't have anything to pay them back. So to me, these text messages don't make a lot of sense. I get that they show some kind of divide between Natalie and Michael. The defense at one point said, well, maybe Are you sure Natalie wrote these? Maybe Michael authored these. And I guess there's some element of a possibility of that. They did say that Michael had taken Natalie's phone for a 2-month period and would not let her have it. I assume her children are going to come in and say that. And maybe they're going to argue that these text messages were written by Michael during that 2-month period, that it didn't have anything. Natalie never wrote it. It was only the fact that he took her phone. That will be pretty evident, I would think. I would think the state would have some real good cross if she had her phone. I mean, you could certainly tell if I didn't use my phone for 2 months, it would look really, really different from the way it looked. So I will look forward to finding out more about that. So the witness, Lieutenant Bledsoe, said that he believed in September of 2018, Michael discovered that there were some aspects of the business related to the amount they were investing that was different from what he'd been told, and that he learned that some people had been promised bigger returns, and he was upset. That really doesn't fully explain, though, why then he was murdered in February of the next year. If in August and September he's figuring it out, why is February such an important time that Natalie suddenly decides, yep, this is the moment, he's going down? It's not super clear about that. There was also this, let me add this back to the stage and show you a final message that Natalie sent to Michael. And this is really interesting because it lists all these amounts for contracts. And she's listing, 3.45 million for this, and it should post tonight at midnight. 300,000 should post on Wednesday. 1.25 million DOD on Thursday, and Monday of next week, 724,000. 2.56 million next Friday, and 108 million around October 12th, and 131 million around December 21st. And she goes on like that, listing all these huge amounts, which totaled about, according to what the prosecution said, I haven't added them up myself, but the prosecution said it was $1.4 billion. To me, it is inconceivable that Michael actually believed that they were doing $1.4 billion. I mean, how is that even possible? They've been in business less than 2 years, and his wife is telling him, oh yeah, we're about to get 1.4 billion. And yet the prosecution does have the text message. So it was extremely important evidence. This is the first evidence that has any real possibility, in my view anyway, of persuading the jury that, yep, Michael did not know about what was going on in his own company. Even though he was involved, even though he was on many of the documents, and the defense did a pretty good job of proving that he didn't know. So I thought this was a super important day, and those text messages were very, very important. So these were the text message she sent to him about the 1.4 billion related to a Bank of America account. The Bank of America account, though, wasn't open until the end of January. And according to the defense, it wasn't even a real account. It wasn't fully finalized until mid-February, after Michael had died. So Natalie, according to this witness, Lieutenant Bledsoe, did several little tricks to try to explain why money wasn't in the account. These would be things she said maybe to Michael, but definitely to other people. She claimed an audit was happening and it was holding up their funds. And the witness said, no, there was no audit. She blamed a fictitious person named Betsy Britton, who supposedly was with the Defense Finance Accounting Service, but there was no Betsy Britton, just fake. And she also had blamed a legitimate government shutdown in 2018, where I assume this is a period of time when it wasn't funded because of Congress having disputes about the funding and not having a budget. And there was a real shutdown, but that had nothing to do with why they weren't getting their money. And the witness also said there was an incident with BB&T that month. I think he meant January, and that he believes Michael did not know about what was going on with the companies, in part because of how Michael acted when he was at BB&T. The Cochrans got a letter from the BB&T in Beckley, where they lived, to inform them that their bank account was going to be closed. And So Mr. Cochran went down there personally, and he was very irate. How dare you? Why are you closing our bank account? It was, according to this witness, to the point that his friend Chris Davis had to be summoned to the bank to try to calm him down. Now, there were so many objections during this part of the testimony. If any of you watched that, I would really like to know, what did you think about all the objections? Because it was a lot. I don't know that I've very often seen that many objections in that period of time, but I would like to know what your opinion of it was, what you thought if you were watching it, what you believed about whether it was too many and that kind of thing. So on the day that Michael actually had the crash, was found in a heap on the kitchen floor, the Cochrans were supposed to go to Virginia to meet with the Bank of America. And the prosecution thinks that's related. That's where Michael was going to find out the truth, or otherwise embarrass himself by not knowing the truth. So at that point, the witness said, well, he did know that Michael was using steroids. He didn't really locate any evidence to confirm that. We know that the witness, that at least one of Natalie's children, and I believe both, are going to testify for the defense. We knew that somebody 17 years old was going to testify today. I assumed that was going to be a prosecution witness, because it did not occur to me the prosecution was going to rest right now. So and you remember that weird, how he did the chart of the 3 vials that were found in Natalie's home, and they were tested by the FBI chemist, and the FBI chemist said, okay, yeah, this is insulin. It says insulin. It is insulin. This is methylprednisolone. Yep, it is. But there was a third one. And that third one said on the label, this is enclomiphene. He said, wow, that's not what this is at all. It's something entirely different. Well, that bottle of enclomiphene citrate, that was actually given to law enforcement by Michael's mother and father, who had it at their home and said, for some reason, Natalie gave it to them after Michael died. So this is Michael's mother, Michael's stepfather, and Natalie brings them this bottle of enclomiphene citrate, which actually contains a completely different substance. So I think the reason for that, I think the reason that the prosecution is bringing this up is enclomiphene, would explain that insulin crash. It could cause that insulin crash. And so if that substance had actually been in the bottle, then maybe that would suggest there was a reason for the insulin crash. Natalie would have known that, since she's a pharmacist, and maybe what she was trying to do was create this explanation for what was happening. And so she gave it to the parents so they would hand it to law enforcement and say, look, I assumed then she would have thought they never would test it, but in fact they did. So there was talk about what happened on the day of the event, that Natalie went to the doctor the day before and again on the day that Michael crashed. Michael never went to the doctor. He was apparently feeling pretty good until the big crash. So when she went to the doctor, Natalie was given promethazine, a shot, and possibly tablets. And Bledsoe thought that was significant because Michael was documented to have a severe allergy to it. But I was confused about that, because then why hasn't that been discussed? Why was this suddenly brought up? They don't seem to have any allegation that it was given to Michael in some way or form. But maybe that would be an argument that they plan to make. So they canceled that meeting they were going to have that day with the Bank of America private banker. Now, what we heard from him when he testified was this wasn't a meeting where we were going to talk about why the 1.4 billion wasn't being credited to their account and what was wrong with us. This was a meeting about us being a private banker for them because they claim to have a lot of money. And then the defense has said also they were going to formally set up their account. You had to do it in person, and they hadn't been there in person to formally set it up. They had an account, apparently. Prosecution proved that today, but they didn't have one that was actually operational, according to the defense. So Natalie did text somebody that morning and say, Mike was so mad about not being able to go this morning that he had to take 2 of my blood pressure pills. So that's yet another reference to another drug he might have taken and another drug related to her. I thought that was a very odd coincidence. So this witness finally did discuss the fake cancer, but he didn't really have much to say about it. He said he didn't uncover any evidence that the defendant did have cancer. Well, that's not the same as saying we found out the defendant doesn't have cancer. So we've been talking about, I knew that there was supposed to be this suggestion that she was faking cancer. That's one of the things that the federal judge talked about in sentencing, but all of the witnesses have just come in and said, yeah, she told me, this text that she had cancer and she was getting chemo and so she wasn't feeling well. At no point has there been evidence that, no, she didn't have that. She didn't actually have cancer. So this is as close as we got. The witness also said that Natalie gave contradictory stories. First interview, April 8th, just a matter of a month and a half after, maybe 2 months after Michael died. She said, we were together at home. He suddenly went into the kitchen. It was morning. About 10 a.m., she heard a thud. And she went into the kitchen. He's on the floor. And then she discovered enclomiphene citrate on the kitchen counter. So that would have been important to show that would be a reason for the blood drop. That's the prosecution argument. There was another interview a month later, May 7th. And this time she said they sat together in the living room for an hour. Michael was doing the best he had ever done in life. That it was not long afterwards, after they'd been sitting an hour, Michael went into the kitchen, threw up in the sink, fell, hit his head on the granite countertop, and ended up on the floor. And enclomiphene was hidden in a cabinet. It was not out on the counter in this story. And then on interview 3, which was the very next day, they went separate ways that morning. That was true on each day. That when she got home, he'd been sleeping on the couch for 45 minutes to an hour. I don't know, maybe after she got home so that she would know how long. Then he woke up, he went into the kitchen, he collapsed, and she introduced that he was allegedly using insulin as a bodybuilding regimen. And he kept that in the house for use in bodybuilding. That was the first time he said that she mentioned that. She said he injected it himself. She didn't help him. He did it himself. And he used several different areas to do the injections, one of which was his back. And the witness said, I thought, did not really understand how he could inject himself in the back. Quote, that seemed odd to me. So Bledsoe said, well, Natalie kept running. After Michael died, Natalie kept running the business. And that suggested to me Michael wasn't really involved. The defense said, well, maybe she just needed money. She needed to keep the family business going. Maybe she didn't have a lot of choice. He actually talked a little bit about the fate scholarships. It's the first time I think they've been introduced here. They were talked about at the federal sentencing hearing, but this is the first time we've heard about them. And then when the one fact that he mentioned that he felt was significant was he showed Natalie a list of the items they had collected after they did a search warrant of the home. And she ran her finger through them and she pointed to one of them, identified that item with her finger and said, oh, insulin, we keep that here. I keep this at home for the neighbor's child who's diabetic. So the prosecution thinks, yeah, that's because she knew that insulin might be something we were looking at, so she needed to explain it away. All right. So Nana of 7 is telling me that the defense, mostly Victor, is rude and tries to make witnesses to agree. I think she's guilty. Prosecution is not aggressive, but I feel they are consistent and steady. All right. Thank you. I appreciate that, Nana of 7, and I appreciate your super chat as well. Thank you. All right. So the defense cross-examination honed in, just went through like a series of points. So I'll just run you through the most important ones that bizarrely, they started out and said, did you lose money in the Ponzi scheme? And he said, no. and I don't have any financial interest in the case. I could not figure out, why was the defense asking that? That's a question the prosecution would ask to show that the witness isn't biased. Why does the defense want to prove that? If anyone has any clue, please let me know. I don't know why it got asked, but maybe they thought he had somehow invested and they thought they were going to get testimony about that. That was all I could think of. So what did Michael know is obviously a super important issue. Here's what the defense sort of made, the points they made through cross, that the defense believes the only reason that the government didn't go after Michael, just like it went after Natalie, is because Michael had died. That if he'd still been alive, they definitely would have gone after Michael. And I think that's almost a certainty. There was suggestion from this witness, oh, well, maybe not. I'm not sure there was really enough evidence. I guarantee you, they had both owned the company. Maybe those text messages would have made a difference, but I'd be surprised. I think it's more likely they would have gone after both. And the defense pointed out when it came to forfeiture, which is we're taking the assets of the person who's getting the criminal conviction. They took the assets of both of them. It wasn't like they said, well, this belongs to Michael, this belongs to Natalie, and they split them up. So both Michael and Natalie were signatories on the bank accounts. They owned the accounts together. They lived a lavish lifestyle together. They both Michael claimed to have sold such a high volume of firearms to the government that their firearms suppliers were rewarding them with 75% discounts. And the witness said, yeah, we knew they weren't selling anywhere near that level. The defense also tried to argue Michael was the big gun guy. He knew all about guns. He was super interested in that, in armor, in all of the things related to military. Natalie knew nothing about it. She didn't really care. But the witness would not really agree with that. He said she had some knowledge of firearms and that she was involved in negotiating with the local police department, for example. And so this was a back and forth exchange, and Michael knew nothing about it. Question. He told everybody to watch War Dogs, one of his favorite movies about the sale of firearms. He was enamored with firearms. And the answer was, well, I just really can't answer that. But that was one of the defense thrusts, is this was Michael's company. This was the thing he wanted to do. So there's no way he would not have been involved in knowing all about what they were purchasing, how much it cost, where it was coming from. He would have wanted to have known that. The expenditures of the two businesses were over $1.1 million, included things like earrings, heating and cooling, getting cash, paying for their car, and that came out of the business account. So their defense is arguing Michael knew that the federal government said both of them enjoyed the proceeds. In other words, had the lifestyle that included a lot of purchases based on this. And but the witness said, I don't think he would have been indicted, and that Michael believed that this was legitimate income coming from a real operating business, even though that was untrue. There was a confusing discussion about the Cochrans listing assets of $522 million at the time of the forfeiture, and the prosecutor signing off on that, the United States attorney signing off on that, but that it wasn't true. They didn't have anything like the defense said they missed it by $500 million. They did not have $522 million at all. They didn't have really much at all. They had the money left over, I guess, from what people had invested, and that was about it. So he said he believes that her cancer is false, but he does not have any records from an oncology clinic or something that would say she doesn't have cancer. He just believes that. He admits he did not interview the Cochran children. That has been a theme throughout the trial. Why not? Why not? Why not? Is what the defense has said. And now they're going to bring them. We are going to hear, I think, from the son at least tomorrow, and maybe from the daughter as well. One is now 17 and the other is 20. So he said, he didn't know a lot about the relationship between Natalie and Michael, and he didn't know who was dominant. That's when we got the information or the suggestion that Michael had taken Natalie's phone for a 2-month period. And the question from the defense was, well, if I told you he controlled Natalie's use of the computers, do you have any evidence to contradict that? And he said, he didn't really have anything on that. So he had not gotten a lot of the old records for Mr. Cochran, Michael, and he didn't have a lot to explain kind of what had happened. And over the course of the years prior to the time that he had the crash and ended up dying 5 days later. And the defense did a fairly good cross with this, said, well, he had epilepsy, he had encephalopathy, he had respiratory failure, he had seizure, he had enlarged heart, he had altered mental state, he had potential sepsis, he couldn't go to the bathroom. And that was before any of these things happened. All of that happened in the months prior, back in November, late October, early November of the year before. So the defense also argued throughout that if he had received insulin, Michael would have been jabbed by Natalie. There would have been a delayed reaction of 15 minutes or more. The numbers varied widely in terms of what the witnesses said, from 5 to 15, 15 to 30. But in any event, it wasn't, here's a shot, bam, you drop. It was going to be a delayed period of time. And the defense has argued he would have done something. If she injected him, then he would have said, what was that? 911, she injected me with something. She won't tell me what it is. I'm scared. Something would have happened. He wouldn't have just waited until he dropped. That wouldn't have been real. And the defense also argued, why would she have asked for the murder weapon from 2 different people? Earlier that day, she called a physician's assistant and said, may have been the day before, I want insulin. I'm sick and I want insulin. And then she asked to borrow insulin from her neighbor who had the son who had diabetes. So the defense said, look, she brought in these people voluntarily. She brought them in and said, hey, I'd like insulin. If that was a murder weapon, who would do that? That was the defense argument. And let's see what else. Another argument the defense made that I thought was pretty effective, and I'm sorry for sort of the shotgun approach, but that's the way it was. It wasn't a narrative. It was like this point, that point, this point, that point. So it just went that way. But I don't want you to miss out on any of the arguments that are being made, so you'll understand the full case. So one of the arguments the defense has made is, if they've been married for 17 years, and there hasn't been any testimony that they had a bad relationship or didn't get along. So why wouldn't, if Michael is suddenly finding this out, why is his first reaction to turn her in? Wouldn't his first reaction be, hey, let's get a lawyer. Let's figure this out. Is there a way to get around this? There were objections around this, but I think the question pretty much put itself to the jury. And then the defense went through a series of times when there had been other problems with Michael, just as we talked about before. Times when friends said, yeah, he was out of it. He was sweating. He was mentally altered. And friends who said he took supplements and that kind of thing. There was one period of time when he said, did you interview Mr. Treadway? And the witness said, no, I would have really, really liked to interview Mr. Treadway, but he wouldn't speak to me. I don't know who Mr. Treadway is, but now I'd like to know what he says too. So then the defense lawyer went on to say, well, isn't it true that Mr. Treadway says that Michael hated Panera Bread, but one day he was so confused he went there anyway? And the witness, there was an objection. I have no idea. He wouldn't talk to me. I don't know what he says. So then we looked at the search of the residence of the Cochrans, the vials that were found there. And they wanted so much for this witness to say how much was in the vial. And they told other witnesses that he was going to say it was full, but he didn't really say that. He said, he couldn't really tell from the photographs whether it was full or not. and he didn't know whether a fair amount had been removed from the bottle or not. He just wasn't able to answer those questions. One issue the defense had talked about was, look, Natalie's a pharmacist. If she wants to kill somebody using drugs, why borrow these from somebody else? Why not just get it at the pharmacy? But the state very logically pointed out, well, she didn't work at the pharmacy anymore. She now was in arms sales to the government, supposedly. So she didn't have access through the pharmacy to drugs that would have killed Michael. At that point, the state rested, and the defense made a motion for acquittal. That's where you ask the judge, look, there's not enough evidence that would suggest that this person is guilty, so we want you, judge, to just dismiss the case. Fine, acquit her so that she's not guilty. And in this case, the judge is like, no, we're going to take it to the jury. And he said, the state told us this was going to be a circumstantial case. We've heard from Dr. Uribe, who said the only way this victim could have died was from insulin. There may have been a motive. At least there's been evidence about that. This is at least a prima facie case. I'm going to send it to the jury. At that point, he sent everybody out, spoke privately with Natalie and her lawyers about her right to testify, but she doesn't have to testify, and then put all that on the record. He didn't want anybody present in the room. So tomorrow, we have the defense going. I don't know how long or how many witnesses they'll end up actually putting on, but I would not be surprised if we wrap up maybe this week or at least the first part of next week. I would think the defense case is not going to be super long, more than, say, a couple of days. So I think we are zipping right through this case, and I think it's going to end pretty soon. So if you have some questions, would you put your questions in the chat with question marks at the beginning? That'll help me spot them as we talk about it. It's been a very dramatic case. It is very light on evidence. It's light on evidence in terms of whether or not they are able to prove that insulin killed him, that there was an injection of insulin, that Natalie did the insulin as opposed to Michael. The defense has done a pretty good job of talking about Michael's supplements, Michael's drugs that he took related to bodybuilding. And I think we are going to hear more about that in the course of the defense. I think his kids are going to say a lot about it. Michael asking, is it cold enough for me? Yes, it is. It's very cold. It is very cold. I know that's true for a lot of us all the way across the country. And I saw a picture of snow down on the Gulf Beach. I have never. It was amazing. They always have white sand, but this was different. This was white snow. It was crazy. Chris Strubing is asking me, does anyone think that Michael was combative when he was waking up because he was trying to tell people that he had a feeling that Natalie was drugging him to off him? So that's an interesting question, Chris. I think one of the things the defense may argue is that he was having steroid rage, that he was taking so many steroids, it was creating that problem for him. The only reason I think that it probably wasn't that is that time when he was combative waking up was back in November when he was there and they stayed all night with him so he wouldn't have to be tied down. His friends stayed with him at night in the hospital. So we did have two people say they didn't want to wake him up and startle him because he might hit them, but they seemed to act like that was something they would do with anybody. It wasn't Michael in particular. He didn't have a special issue. All right, Alpha Fox Adam. Court TV noted that the defense had 12 witnesses set to testify. I wonder if we'll see them all. Probably not. Typically, there's some on there. Oh, there is one not on there, and the defense and the prosecution talked about it, and the prosecution agreed that the defense could bring this witness, even though not on the list. Don't know who that will be. As to whether or not Natalie will testify, I don't think so. I think that would be an enormous mistake. One of my mentors used to say, when you get to the end of your case, if you're not winning, you're not ever going to win, because that's as high as it gets. That's as good as it gets. After, when the other side has time to come and poke holes in what you have to say, then from that point on, your case is getting worse. So the strongest it is at the end of the presentation of your evidence. The one exception to that is a defendant who testifies in a case, because the defendant then becomes the most important testimony in the case. And the way the jury feels and thinks about them is all important. We certainly saw that in the Alec Murdaugh case. Lily asked me, have you garnered any opinion how the jury will vote by watching them in person? So Lily, I'm at my home office now. I'm no longer in West Virginia. So I don't have any intel in terms of what's happened yesterday and today. In the first couple of days, I just felt like they were listening and paying attention. I didn't sense a direction or that they were reacting a certain way. But I did feel like two witnesses were reacting to some sort of aggressive cross-examination by the defense. Did I say witnesses? Two jurors were reacting. But that was the only thing that I kind of picked up on that I felt like had some importance. Why was the defendant allowed to go to the sidebar? KP, such a good question. We've all been wondering about that. I haven't seen that before either. That is brand new to me, but the defendant is invited up by the judge. So I guess that's a normal thing there. That's how they do it. 1776 daughter is asking me, do you think that the defense did a lot of testifying with their questions that went unchallenged? Yes, I do. And I think there could have been a lot more objections from the prosecution. There were a ton of objections today, really from both sides, but the defense objections were a lot. Now, as far as the testifying, yes. The biggest example is the one I gave you where the witness said, I wasn't able to talk to this guy. And he says, isn't it true that this guy says such and such? Well, obviously the guy can't possibly know that because he said he didn't talk to them. But it's something the jury has now heard. So we've heard a lot in the questioning about Michael's use of steroids, Michael's use of supplements. We've heard a little bit about it from the witnesses, but we've heard a lot about it in terms of the questions. So there is some extent to which there is testifying in the way the questions are done. If there's no objection, that's that. And for the most part, I feel like they were pretty legitimate based on facts. Now, there were that one today, clearly not based on any fact that's going to come in evidence since the defense hasn't even talked to him. Unless maybe prosecution. Maybe the defense will bring that witness. Maybe that's the new witness. Who knows? Ducati girl asked, did they ever actually fulfill a contract or was it all a scam? So that is a really good question. I don't think we have a super clear answer. There was a suggestion by a couple of witnesses that they did a little bit, like maybe $100,000 in terms of contracts. But they talked about this $1.4 billion that was coming in, and they had no contracts that would support that. They didn't have these. They were just made up. Just like the woman who supposedly was auditing them and refusing to pay them and was just made up. If she knew he was taking insulin, why wouldn't she tell the doctors to save his life? Kyle Nitz asked. Oh, that is a great question. Because if she knew he was taking insulin and his blood sugar was really low, then maybe she ought to say, hey, it's probably okay. He takes insulin, and maybe he had done that. Super good question, though. I think that especially being a pharmacist, she would have known about the impact of that and would have known the correlation between what he was experiencing and what he was taking. I wonder what she would say to that. Great question. Some nobody. Why don't you believe that Michael didn't know? He toughed the money was coming from government contracts. Not so hard to believe. Did you think Maggie knew about Alec's fraud? Okay, here is the reason why I think he probably knew. He was on the bank accounts. He was on the prosecution said he wasn't on the documents, right? To witness number one. And witness number one said, right, it was all hers. So the defense got up there and said, well, what about this document and that document and this document? Here's another. And went on for a while with all the documents that he was on, in addition to the fact he had quit his job to work for the company and he was on the bank account. So that's why when I look at that, my natural thought is, or my first thought is, yeah, he knew. It takes things like those kind of bizarre text messages to give me at least some thought that maybe he didn't. So that's my explanation for why I think that. What are the dates of Natalie's text messages to the three family members? It's super hard to read. let's add this to the stage, and y'all can tell me if you can read that. I think it says something like August 20 something. So that's what I think it says. But it there, that one's a little bigger. And at the bottom, I think it says 8/26/2018. And the witness did say that the Michael, he felt, had an awareness of something in September of 2018. So around that time frame. So that's what I think it is. Yeah, these are really great questions. Tonight have been great questions. And I'm only going to have time for a couple more. Let me go over here and say, hey, Amber Natalia is a new member. Thank you so much. We're glad to have you. Elaine Baldy is asking me, I know the prosecution doesn't need to prove motive, but what do you think her motive was? I don't know. And I don't think they haven't given me a real comfort level that the one they've come up with is the reason. But I'm not really sure about him not knowing. These text messages are very, very important. Super important. Her statement that I wasn't fully transparent with Michael, but they were 6 months before he died. And so that's still an issue to be discussed. The judge cracks me up, says Shiroshina. I really like this judge. Super nice, just very relaxed, very friendly with the jury. Really great lawyer and judge. Oh, Blue Octopus on here has known her for many years. Interesting. That's very interesting. And let's see, I'm looking for the question marks at the beginning. I think I might have skipped a couple that were right there. My apologies if I skipped you. Kathleen asked, why did she have a blood glucose meter and testing strips in her home? So I have asked that question too. I've wondered about that, but here's, I think, the reason. She did do teaching around blood insulin regulation. That was something she taught as a pharmacist. And so maybe she had them there for teaching people. She also said she kept that vial of insulin in case the neighbor's son suddenly needed it, like just in case. If he had a diabetic dive and was really in bad shape, she would have the insulin right there to help him. So that was what she stated to law enforcement in the interview. All right. Well, tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Eastern, we will be back looking at this case. We will have our first peek into the defense and to what they're going to be arguing. Hopefully, we'll have heard from at least one of Natalie's children, maybe from their expert witness on insulin. Who knows? Maybe Natalie herself, although I don't think so. I think that would be absolutely crazy. And the reason I think that is the case is teetering on evidence anyway. All she could do is provide the weight to tip it over to the defense, to the prosecution side. I don't think it could do anything else. So that is my thinking on that. All right. Well, I will see you all tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern. Looking forward to it.